All right, I think we can get started.
Perfect. So good evening from London. My name is Ivanka Barzashka, and I'm the managing director of the King's Wargaming Network. I'm sorry, there's some difficulty on my end. So I'm joined today by my colleague Jonathan Rich from New York, and Jonathan and I have been working together for a number of years on designing, executing, and analyzing strategic analytical war games, and more recently have begun exploring the topic of what does it mean to do that in an online digital environment. So the topic of today's talk is information security in online and in-person games. And so the focus is on analytical games, that is games that are run for research purposes, and specifically analytical games that explore strategic level decisions. So I'll start with the problem, research aims, and scope, then talk about how we went about thinking and answering these questions, and then I'll hand it over to Jonathan, who'll highlight some of our initial findings and conclude with the implications for this research. So our investigation was motivated by the problem of how to run analytical war games during the pandemic. And we approached this from the perspective of a principal investigator. So this is someone who directs a research study and uses war games as a method of inquiry. And I say principal investigator and not war game designer, and often they're the same person. But this is ultimately the person responsible for ensuring that an analytical war game meets required standards and delivers quality inputs as required by either a sponsor or the commitment to academic excellence. So we're responding to two areas of growing demand. One is the demand for analytical wargaming and the need to run war games for research purposes in a manner that is more scientific, that is more professionalized, and that meets established academic and legal standards. And the second is a shift from in-person manual gaming to gaming in a remote digital format. And this shift has been accelerated by social distancing and lockdown measures that have been enforced during the pandemic. And it has implications for analytical games, which is what we're going to talk about today. So the shift to a digital medium affects the ways and means by which gameplay data are collected, how they're stored and analyzed. And with that, online gaming introduces new information security risks. So this means that all researchers that want to design and execute analytical games need to come with these new terms, with these risks quickly, understand what they are, and also how to mitigate them. So information security has important implications for research ethics, for research integrity, for personal data protection. And so what's really at stake here is the feasibility and viability of analytical war games. Now, I said we're looking at this problem from the perspective of the principal investigator. And in a pandemic environment, that person would be seeking to ensure that analytical war games meet these academic standards, that they comply with general data protection laws, and that they do so within the resource constraints, so the time, the staff, the budget that is already available. And this assumes that doing a war game online is just your only option. So how can we ensure that that meets those research requirements? Now, principal investigators in a post-pandemic setting, when they can choose between running a game online or running a game in person, they'll need to do that in a systematic way, and so we're thinking about how to inform that decision. How do you make the choice between an in-person or a remote game? And information security will be one of those criteria. Not the only one, but certainly one of those criteria. So this problem isn't important just to the principal investigator. It's important also to other actors, other stakeholders that are part of this process. For the research sponsor or the end user of the analytical insights that an analytical game generates, they'll be interested in ensuring that information security is preserved because of the data integrity piece, and which has implications for the quality of those insights. Now, for game participants, the players, the human subjects from whom data are being collected, for those people, they need to have the confidence and have given their informed consent in how the data is going to be used, why the data is going to be used, and be assured that the researchers and the research institution which they're a part of is doing their bit to ensure that their data is being reasonably protected. And so with that context in mind, we looked at two broad sets of questions relevant to both a pandemic environment and also post-pandemic environment. The first being, is this at all feasible? Is running an analytical war game that meets these research ethics, academic integrity, legal standards, is that feasible and viable within this online medium? And what is it going to take to achieve that? I mean, is that something that we can do within the available resources that we have? The second question, which will be the focus of our talk today, is how do you decide? And between an online game and an in-person game, and is it really true that online games are less secure than their in-person variants? For many in the wargaming community, and particularly those focused on strategic analytical games, manual in-person events have been the norm. And so what we're going to explore today is how do information security risks compare across an in-person and an online variant, and also how do the mitigation strategies compare, and what does it take to make sure that some of those risks are mitigated. So let me talk a little bit about the methodology, how we went about answering these questions, and make some key some points on the assumptions that we made on scope. So we're focusing on strategic analytical war games. So that's war games that are eliciting and collecting data from human subjects on strategic level decisions and the outcomes of those decisions. And so these are particularly games that are run in a seminar format that involve the collection of qualitative data rather than a hex encounter rigid game that's more focused on military operations or tactics. And I've also included some definitions on information security and information security risk. And I'll leave it to Jonathan to explain what that means a bit more in the discussion on our findings. So we developed a framework that is based on decision and risk analysis to systematically evaluate information security risks in analytical war games and their risk mitigation strategies. So we've used this process that you see there on the chart to identify security risks, information security risks for a particular game and ways to mitigate them. But this process that you see is generalizable to a range of analytical games, not just the game design that we'll be talking about today. And so we'll be focusing in this presentation on the items that you see there in blue, which are what information security risks should a researcher be thinking about. We then examine, we have examined the consequences and likelihoods of those risks to highlight what we thought were some of the big ones. And so for an analytical game to meet these academic and legal requirements, which risks should a researcher really be worried about? We'll highlight some of those risks. And then we'll answer these questions. The answers to these questions provides a solid foundation to then start brainstorming about mitigation strategies. And Jonathan will talk about those as well. So we're comparing information security risks and risk mitigation strategies across two architectures of a strategic analytical war game conducted with international participants. And so for the basis of this comparison, we're using a game that we designed called the Competitive Strategies Analytic Group Experiment. We developed this this method in 2019 with Jonathan. And this method has been cleared for application for a particular research project by the King's College London Research Ethics Committee. And so we've run multiple versions of this game in different formats for the purpose of evaluating these information security risks. We'll compare two architectures. The first being an in-person game modeled on a game that we've run at King's with manual data collection, and the second architecture being a design for remote execution using commercial off-the-shelf software and using digital means of data collection. So this is the theoretical framework. This is the game that we're using to identify and compare these information security risks, and it's also informed by the execution of multiple iterations of CSAGE in different settings. So from 2019 to 2020, we ran versions of this game in different locations, including King's and Lawrence Livermore National Lab. And at the beginning of the pandemic travel restrictions, we were able to run a hybrid version of the game with teams based in person at American University in DC, and others joining in as adjudicators remotely from London. We've also tested a fully remote digital version of the game several months ago, and so all of these iterations give us a good baseline on which to further shape and inform the conversation about risk. So I'll talk a little bit about the architectures, and C-Sage has a flexible modular design with some unique decision analysis features. But we'll consider the simplest C-Sage design here in order to identify the design features that are really relevant to understanding information security risks, and also those that are generalizable to other analytical games. So most of the design features we held constant across the two games to allow us to directly compare these games, and so both versions had the same research purpose and objectives. They also had the same sources of information. So, who are researchers collecting information on? These main sources of information, the human data subjects in the game are the players. And C-Sage involves 3 teams, each of which are comprised of 2 to 3 players. By 3 teams, I mean 2 player teams and an adjudication team. And these people are normally based in different geographic locations, and so need to come together in order to participate in the game. So types of information, the research team, which is comprised of the principal investigator, game staff that are supporting the execution of the game, and administrative staff. They collect 2 types of information from these human data subjects. One bit of information is on the players themselves, and the other is on various aspects of their gameplay. And so some of this information is personally identifiable, either directly or indirectly. And other information is anonymized or pseudo-anonymized. And the reason for collecting this information is twofold. The first is to arrange event logistics, and the second is to meet research objectives. So to arrange logistics, administrative staff, they require information like names and emails, and game staff need to know how people are allocated across teams. Also, research staff need to justify the sample of participants, that sample of participants meets the inclusion criteria of the study. So this requires collecting information like professional affiliations or other demographic information, which could be used to indirectly identify people, particularly when you're dealing with a small group of people with very niche expertise. And gameplay data also includes summaries of player conversations, players' descriptions of their objectives, decisions and outcomes of those decisions, and answers to other questions that might be relevant to the research topic. So this type of game data is anonymized and typically recorded under a team identifier, and it should not normally, if the game is executed right, none of that gameplay data should include any personally identifiable information, like who said what. So in both versions of the game, the data are generated either by the players themselves or by game staff, which are rapporteurs who observe players and record summaries of their conversations. And we appreciate that in an online environment, you have additional opportunities for easily collecting data, like recording players' conversations. But we didn't do that because we wanted to have architectures that are comparable. So in both the in-person and online version, we still had game staff, rapporteurs recording what players said in the course of gameplay. The other element that remained common between these two different architectures is the game execution process. The game execution process includes 3 phases of activity that are relevant to data collection. And so you have pre-game activities, gameplay activities, and post-game activities. Now, these pre-game activities include player selection, logistics planning, and participant arrival. Gameplay activities are similarly structured and timed across both the online and in-person versions. And so just to give you an example, CSAGE takes about 1 working day. It includes 2 game moves, each take about 3 hours, and there's a plenary session at the end. And so each move includes the team's decisions, the adjudicated outcome of those decisions, and a move is divided into 3 sessions focused on different tasks with breaks in between sessions. And these are the tasks that players need to meet. The post-game activities essentially include participant departure. And so this entire game process in its core components is the same across the 2 architectures. Now, a number of features change in those architectures. The player selection remains the same, but the means of data collection affect activities and outputs across that remaining game execution process. And so with that, I'll hand it over to Jonathan to talk a little bit more about those differences and what they entail for information security risks.
Great. Thanks, Ivanka. And yeah, we're going to talk a little bit now about some of the initial findings that relate to this question of whether online games are less secure than their in-person variants. And so, with that in mind, today's focus is really on 3 things. One of the things we'll touch on are some of the values related to the decision about how to ultimately handle these risks. So in this context today, we're taking a pretty limited frame relative to the thinking and work that we did, but the focus is going to be on information security, which, as Ivanka introduced before, is about preserving the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of information. And we'll give a couple of examples of this in a few minutes to really highlight what we mean by this. A couple things just to point out on this values component. What we're not going to do today is talk about how these affect research ethics or legal compliance with GDPR. There's certainly a whole lot of consideration for what to do in filling out a research ethics application or meeting those GDPR requirements, but we don't have enough time to go into that. The other piece related to values is that information security is not the only value that principal investigators are thinking about when they're designing and executing games, and there's certainly other things that go into the decision criteria. So I'll hint at a few of those, but really for today, we're focused on this topic of information security and how we preserve these objectives. The other thing that really will be the main focus are what are some of these information security risks. So when I talk about risks, we're talking about uncertainties to meeting information security. And those can be things that both come from accidental actions or deliberate intent to harm. So in thinking about risks, we'll touch on both of those. And instead of boring you with the whole long list of risks we came up with, we'll focus on a few of the main ones that emerged from our work. And then, finally, we've got decisions. So from a risk mitigation perspective, now that we understand what values we want to achieve, what risks we might be faced with, this question comes up about what decisions can we make to manage those risks during the design and execution of analytical war games. So the reason we lay this all out is, certainly at the end of the day, all we can do is make decisions. And in designing and executing games, we want to be very thoughtful in how we do that with those values in mind and with those risks in mind. And one thing I want to highlight, just to kind of clear up any perception, is that while this was done in an academic environment for this game, this is a very practical exercise and way that a lot of organizations think about managing risks. So I'll jump a little bit more into this notion of a journey of a player who wants to be anonymous and try and bring a little bit of a visual to what Ivanka was talking about before. So as she mentioned, we're comparing two different architectures. The first is an in-person game where you can kind of imagine across these activities, if you put yourself in the shoes of the player, they're talking to an admin who books their flight and hotel. They end up traveling, in this case, to London to participate in the game. They show up, check in at their hotel. They go to the building, check in at the security desk to show up for the initial game briefing, and maybe they attend a social event after that. So, a lot of activities fall into this notion of pregame, and you can kind of imagine, hopping on a plane and all of the things you do between there and participating in the actual game. The second piece related to gameplay. So, once you arrive and participate in the game, for this in-person version, it's really focused on paper, staying away from technology as much as possible. Players fill out paper forms. The rapporteurs take handwritten notes. There's a lot of face-to-face discussion, and ultimately you're just doing that data transfer by hand by saying, here's what I wrote down, here's my piece of paper, and that's the extent of the gameplay for this in-person version. And then for that post-game, the staff basically collects all those materials. The researcher takes all the game data and puts it in a filing cabinet somewhere, and everyone leaves and flies home. So, I think from that perspective, we're looking at one version, one architecture. Now we transition over to the other architecture that involves playing the exact same game remotely, and it's very different. And this is something that we all went through this week just to participate in the conference, right? Like, you get a calendar invite or invitation to participate. You sign into video conferencing somewhere. Everything's done remotely. You can chat with people over chat and video and phone. And as we get into the gameplay component, this is where players are having discussions over video chat. They're filling out their forms on a computer. The actions are posted to a website that then adjudicators pull and read and think about. So there's a lot of engagement with that digital environment that happens. And for the post game, instead of all that stuff getting collected by hand, you're sending or posting that material to a file somewhere, or emailing it somewhere, and the researcher keeps it on the cloud, and everyone just logs off and day's over. So you have a very similar experience in a lot of ways, but very different touch points. And we'll talk about those in a little more detail in the coming slides. So just to kind of recap the gameplay piece, there's three main areas that we looked at to think about the risks. So you have the collection of data, you have the exchange of data, and the storage of data. And just for some context, for the online game, we're looking at using Zoom. We use Google Forms to collect some of the data, and then we use Basecamp to post and interact with the other players as needed, and to do that information exchange. I think all of our findings are pretty platform independent. You can sub in Teams, you can sub in many of the other ones, and at least for the level we're looking at things today and the granularity of risk mitigation strategies, we're not going to focus too much on selection of a software provider. I know everyone has strong thoughts about what the best one is there, but I don't want to touch that one with a 6-foot pole today. So for this in-person versus online game, from the data collection perspective, I mentioned it's filling out forms by hand and writing things down as opposed to typing them up. For the exchange, it's that face-to-face conversation, the physical exchange of paper versus video, or posting items to a Basecamp. And then for storage, it's locking it in a filing cabinet, or storing it on the cloud. So I think we can all relate to those differences, but keep those in mind as we start talking about some of the risks. The pre-game area is one where I think we started this exercise and we're so focused on the gameplay, but then had a lot of interesting discussions about what happens before a game even starts and what are the implications to information security in this pre-game activity realm. And the two main things here to consider are the logistics planning. So in the in-person game, there's a lot of personally identifiable information that needs to be collected by the admins and the building, security staff. So I can, relate to one of my first game experiences on different but similar game. I had to send in my passport information, my date of birth, so they could book my flights and hotel. And then I showed up at the building and, gave that same information to a security guard and signed my name on a piece of paper next to the name of the Wargaming event that I was there for. That's a very different experience than one where, you're getting an invitation by sharing your email and showing up in an online environment. The other area just related to participant arrival. I mean, I touched on a few of those things already, but basically international travel and accommodation and just having to move around and get from place to place leads to a lot of touch points, and that's very different than just accessing that application through a personal computer. So from the pregame perspective, this is one of the big distinctions we want to draw. And just to kind of visualize this a little more, from the perspective of information nodes and the flow of information, when you agree to participate in a game, a lot of times you're just thinking about that interaction with the principal investigator and what you're telling them, what information you're sharing with them. But from the perspective of a player who wants to be anonymous, there are a lot of considerations about how your anonymity is impacted. So, the investigator is communicating with a game administrator, who's then communicating with you to arrange the logistics. You are interacting with other players, with game staff. There's certainly plenty of people during the gameplay that you're talking to and who know you by name, even though you want to be anonymous. And then there's this whole other area of, the security guard, the people passing by, the hotel staff. I mean, it sounds a little ridiculous at first, but from the perspective of someone who doesn't want to be linked to a certain game, these are certainly considerations that have emerged for some of the games we've been working on, and that changes pretty drastically in this online environment. So essentially all those other ancillary interactions go away, and you're really just communicating with that principal investigator, with the admin and the other participants, and you're doing it in a way that's a lot more limited than before. You're sharing less information. some of those engagements are more limited. And I'm not saying that's better for the overall objectives of a game, right? Like we all like being in person, we all like interacting, we all like those experiences. But we're just looking at this from that very narrow view of information security. So I don't want to make it seem like I'm saying, just stay away from interacting with people and everything will be okay. It's just that these touch points need to be considered when we're planning for information security. And I think just kind of to make this a little more concrete, what I want to share are a few of the major information security risks that emerged from the exercise we went through that Ivanka talked about before. So, we went through this process of identifying and brainstorming all the different risks that can impact those information security objectives. And we picked a few of the top ones that emerged after we looked at consequences and likelihoods that we'll talk about today. And certainly happy to engage on the longer list offline as well. But for the in-person game, a few of the big ones that came up were the first related to like this deliberate risk to confidentiality, where someone's personal information is exposed because of an outside threat. And I mentioned before that you're sharing passport information, you're sharing this information with people to show up at this in-person game. So great example, the admin's email's hacked, they get all the passport information and the list of all the game participants, and that can cause some pretty serious consequences to the research institution and to the principal investigator. So in this particular case, that data breach has legal liability under GDPR. Certainly, being in the U.S., we're not as worried about GDPR as in the UK where this game was run, but those requirements also exist and are increasing, and there's plenty of other regulations that we need to be aware of. And as Ivanka mentioned, it's not just about the regulations; it's about what your participants expect for you or from you. And then the other consequence is certainly the ethics breach if the identity of a person can be linked to the research project and the data. From the perspective of some of the mitigation examples or decisions that can be taken to mitigate this risk, and when we talk about mitigating risk, it's about both reducing the likelihood or the consequence or both of these outcomes. And so some of the main things we were looking at was related to cyber security training for the admin staff. Another decision that we explicitly made in the game design is to not have the admin and game staff be the same individuals. And so the admins don't have access to that pseudo anonymization that happens where they can then connect the participants to the game data. So in that particular case, certainly the personally identifiable information can still be at risk, although we do try and mitigate it with some of that training. But it becomes a lot more difficult to then make the link to the actual game data and the views that people have in playing the game. And relative to an online game, the risk doesn't really exist because passport data isn't collected. So this is just, I would say more in the realm of examples that fall under this overall deliberate risk to confidentiality that we needed to be very aware of in our ethics application. The second one is related to the accidental risk as it relates to data availability. So here we're talking about data loss or theft with no redundancy of the game materials. And classic example here on the accidental case is data is stored in the bottom drawer of a filing cabinet. An office gets flooded and all of a sudden it's gone. And it's an easy one to laugh at, but I know plenty of PhD students from back when I was in school that had similar experiences with some of their research data, and certainly plenty of other cases that I'm sure we all know someone who has had something like this this happens. So it might fall in the category of a low likelihood, but it's certainly a high consequence risk that can be avoided. And from a mitigation perspective, here it's like you can scan all of that, upload the paper game data to a digital backup, and achieve achieve that objective of reducing that lack of redundancy. So that's a pretty resource intensive ask depending on the game you're playing, but it's certainly an option. And relative to the online game, the risk of physical data loss is significantly reduced because all that data is automatically stored on local hardware or the cloud, and the ability to back it up is pretty much second nature for most of those services now, whether it's accidental or deliberate. And then the last one for the in-person game I'll focus on is related to this accidental risk that relates to confidentiality. And this is about identification of game participants. So, as Ivanka mentioned before, we had a lot of high-profile participants in our game, and that was certainly an audience we were looking to attract. And you have this case where you're running a game in a public space, and a student sees someone walk into a room for a war game. They snap a picture, they post it on Twitter and tag the person. That's certainly a situation we need to avoid for a player that wants to be kept anonymous. And that's both a potential breach of the ethics protocol if the person can be linked to that research project and data, and it certainly is doing no favors to having that person come back for another event. And for this, a lot of it, it goes to that theme of training and getting game staff and players to keep their reason for being on site a secret. I mean, we talked about, in the context of brainstorming, everything from the very practical example of like, just don't display runes, signage for the room that says, XYZ war game over here, because that's basically an advertisement to everyone around, all the way to the, certainly more disruptive or even silly suggestions of running the game offsite and providing secure transport or disguising the anonymous player. So the point here is it's about a brainstorming exercise. You need to come up with solutions to mitigate these risks if you're worried about them, and they should work for your project. And relative to an online game, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in the next set of risks related to that online game, the risk of a passerby identifying someone is significantly reduced if you're playing the game online from home or your office. So this is a quick summary of three of the top ones we talked about. Certainly ones we were thinking about in our project, and they may or may not relate to the ones you're working on, but we want to use this as a starting point for some discussion about risks. With that, I'll turn to quickly cover the risks in an online game. And here, there's some similar ones. So, this identification of game participants that I was just talking about exists in an online environment too. You can have a family member of a player see someone on a computer and do the same thing. And while the likelihood of that may be much lower, it's still a possibility. So when we think about risks, it's about relative risk of the in-person versus online game. It's not to say those risks go away. And, relative to that in-person game, when we were talking about having this online game, one of the key arguments for doing it in person is that you can have greater control over that gameplay environment, and you don't have that inability to see the people off the screen, right? Like there could be someone that's standing next to me during this whole presentation that's, for whatever reason, choosing to watch me talk from the side, and no one would know that they're there. So it's something that maybe is less likely at home, where you're certainly around people that you trust, but that's assuming that player identification process is sound and you're getting the right people to participate. Also related to that is this deliberate risk to confidentiality, where unknown remote threats can steal confidential information. I think for us, this is certainly one of the big ones, and one of the ones that's talked about a lot, where you kind of have this long list of deliberate risks that emerge in a remote environment. And a lot of them are very, very low likelihood events, but they can take multiple different forms. One example, just a simple one that rose to the top of our efforts to make this more concrete is the game rapporteur that uses screen capture to record a video conversation without anyone knowing. And you kind of have the same issue of participants being identified and, more importantly, linked to the judgments that they have during the game. So that can be certainly a dangerous consequence to the research institution and the principal investigator. For this, it's about carefully recruiting and training the game rapporteurs. And so at King's, there's a pretty in-depth process for selecting people and training them on how to run games. And it doesn't mean those risks go away, but you certainly have greater control over that gameplay environment, and you can lower that risk of a remote observer collecting data. And finally, along the lines of the data in the filing cabinet, there's always that chance that something gets accidentally deleted. This rose to the top of our list because of the consequence, but the likelihood's pretty low given that you can implement user permissions and have automated backups. So depending on what systems you use, these are certainly options that make this risk go away. And in the in-person game, we talked about that higher risk to accidental data loss, and the fact that you need to use more resources to kind of achieve the same end. So online opens up a lot of doors there. So I'm gonna kind of summarize a few of our key takeaways. And the objective before was to lay out how we're thinking about risk, how we try and use some examples to then talk about what mitigation strategies look like. But given the time we have, I would say there's a few findings we had from going through this exercise. And the first relates to the nature of risk. So the first point to bring up is that online games with international participants require less personally identifiable information, and therefore pose a lower confidentiality risk. That's, I think, pretty straightforward from what we talked about before, but it's a extremely important consideration when we're looking at things from the consequence perspective. The other thing is that online games simultaneously open the door to remote and unknown deliberate risks because there's more endpoints that can't be controlled. So that scales with the number of people participating in your game. If they have weak settings on their router, that opens up more doors for those deliberate attackers to come in and access your data. We viewed this as a pretty low risk for the games that we were playing in an academic context, for unclassified games, but certainly something to keep in mind depending on your individual games. Next is that video conferencing makes it more difficult to separate the personally identifiable information from gameplay data, because you can basically record someone more easily making a judgment about a certain situation. So that exposes games to both the accidental and deliberate intent that we talked about, whereas in-person games make it easier to separate the two types of data because you can anonymize at source, and you're basically just worried about anyone who's in the room, which can be avoided with good recruitment and training of staff. And finally, there's cybersecurity risks for in-person games, even if it's fully manual, and physical risks for online games, even if they're fully remote. So a few of the examples we talked about before relate to running an in-person game, and most of the risks actually emerge from the cyber realm, right? Like stealing the admin email account and getting personally identifiable information. You're exposed to that risk there. Whereas on the running the online game, you're still exposed to that physical risk of someone walking by and identifying someone. On the topic of mitigation strategies, a few food for thought for discussion is that in-person games still require digital solutions to mitigate information security risks. We highlight the importance of training game staff and players and communicating expectations across both the in-person and online games as a great low-hanging fruit and way to mitigate a lot of those, especially unintentional actions that lead to these risks emerging. And then, finally, there's a lot of low likelihood deliberate risks in online games that require cybersecurity expertise. And, I think that's one of the big topics where I'll touch on that a little in the concluding thoughts. But basically, if you don't have that cybersecurity risk on your team and you're not thinking about the low-hanging fruit, you can very easily make those low likelihood risks much higher likelihood ones. And I think for our particular project, we went into it already thinking about of those cybersecurity best practices, implementing user access management, making sure that the right people had access to the data, that it wasn't stored longer than it needed to be. But that's something that requires some thought and just can't be passively addressed. So looping back to the research question Ivanka posed before about whether remote online games are less secure than their in-person variants, I'll leave with one concluding thought, and it's basically that remote games require different information security risk mitigation strategies and skill sets than in-person games. I know that says online games, but it's in-person games. And whether an online game is less secure than an in-person variant really depends on the level of technical expertise of your team, the resources that you have available. So, there's plenty of risk mitigation options that may be out of reach because of time, because of money. There's plenty of resource constraints. And then finally, related to the trade-offs you're willing to make on game design and execution. So you can think of all the ways to make a game as secure as possible and eliminate all those information security risks. But if at the end of the day, no one wants to show up and play, that's a much bigger consideration. So I will leave it at that. We'll use the remaining time for questions. And one thing I just want to highlight is that the findings from this research and the work we've been doing will be published in a lot greater detail, and we're certainly interested in getting feedback and having some further discussion around this. So our emails are here. Please feel free to reach out, and I think we can turn to a few questions.
So Jonathan, I think you just answered that question, but the question is it that digital wargaming is more secure, or rather that it can be more secure? And I think the answer is in the question, which is it can be made more secure. And what that requires is a deliberate thought process, skills and expertise that you might not normally have as part of your team, and resources that you might not have planned for allocating to this problem.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add to that. So if there's another question, we're happy to take that one too.
So the other question is, does doing a game virtually change the nature of the information handling in or human subject roles? In other words, is face-to-face a meeting which doesn't require review, while online data collection does require review? all games run for all analytical games, so games that are run for research purposes require a review by a research ethics committee. Universities have their own research ethics committee. The Ministry of Defense has its own research ethics committee. The Department of Energy has its own research ethics committee. So it's if you are collecting data from human subjects that is being used for research purposes, you're subject to those research ethics requirements. In addition to that, you are legally liable to meet data protection requirements based on the jurisdiction of your game participants. So that ties into the next question that I see in the chat, which I'll wait to be posted. And Jonathan, do you would you like? Is there anything you'd like to add?
No, I think that for that one you covered it, and yeah, I think for this next one you started touching on that. So I'll let you start, and I can add in any thoughts.
Well, so the question is, how much is this about the EU? And are they're not. The U.S. doesn't have the same considerations. So we're talking about three requirements that researchers that are using war games for research purposes need to meet. The first being research ethics, the second being research integrity. In a university setting, research integrity standards and not meeting those standards, which breaches of those standards, which include fabrication, falsification, misrepresentation of data. Those are all fireable offenses, depending on the level of severity. And then you need to comply with laws on data protection, which are, that's a legal requirement. You can get fined, and this is about ensuring that personal data, which is either directly or indirectly identifiable, is handled fairly and responsibly. And so you have the UK has a UK general data protection law. The UK is no longer part of the EU, so the EU has a separate law that is consistent with that. California has its own set of legal requirements that pertain to the protection of personal data, and so you might not know this, but you are legally liable when you are collecting personal data from somebody that lives in California. You're legally liable to the laws of that jurisdiction. If we invite somebody that lives in France and we're collecting personal data from that person, we need to ensure that the standards that we have in place meet EU data protection requirements, and that's something that specifically is identified in a research ethics application. So they ask you, are you meeting? Can you demonstrate that you're meeting those legal requirements? And that's policed by a research ethics committee. And again, if you are found in breach of those protocols, of those standards, that can certainly have consequences for you personally as a researcher. But more importantly, we talk about consequences, but this is about ensuring that analytical war games are producing reliable, credible insights, and that they do so with the consideration of treating the people that participate in these games, the data subjects, fairly and responsibly, and that's an ethical obligation that we have as war game designers, as researchers, regardless of whether this is something that is being policed, or which part of the ocean we're we reside on.
Yeah, and I think just to add one last thought to that, I know we're at the end of the time, but this question about how it relates to university versus government, and I'll even add in commercial setting to this as well. Having worked for companies that engage with customers both in the U.S. and Europe, and that have offices in both, it's a big part of the everyday considerations we have for data sharing, exchange, and analysis.
Well, with that, I think we're at the end of our time. So thank you very much for tuning in on YouTube. And again, please contact us at the emails you see on the screen for further discussion on this topic. And we are planning on publishing the results. And if you're interested in learning more about the academic requirements and how they translate to analytical and educational war games. So this discussion that we had on research ethics, academic integrity, please tune in tomorrow for my presentation on that would explore these in much greater detail.
Great. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.